Hello, folks, and welcome to an intriguing webinar on the evolution of S/MIME email encryption. Today, we are going to grapple with the conflicts between true end-to-end encryption and modern best practices in email security. A little bit about me. My name is Kyle Newman. I am the CISO of Ziva Incorporated, an identity and cryptography products and services company. I'm also the director of trust framework development, a nonprofit trade association serving healthcare called Direct Trust. The organization, in fact, makes heavy use of S/MIME email encryption for exchanging health information between hospitals, payers, and other parties in healthcare over an ANSI-accredited standard called the Direct Protocol. Before we get into the discussions of the issues related to S/MIME email encryption, it's probably worth talking a little bit more about why S/MIME email encryption is important in the first place. So that's where we'll start today. In general, email is not about just exchanging messages between two parties. It's in fact much more than that, as evidenced by the statistics that make up the data within an email server. 95% of that data is actually file attachments. So you thought a lot of your information was stored in Google Cloud or SharePoint or some other file management system, but in fact, a lot of that information winds up in an email server too. And it's not just sort of low-level staff exchanging templates and documents of that nature, but 87% of senior managers upload business files to an email or cloud account. And when it comes to increasing the attack surface of an organization, phishing winds up being the chosen tactic for nation-state actors to levy an attack against an enterprise. So email is not only the method under which we exchange important information, but it's also a vector of attack for virtually anybody that wants to get into an organization, but oftentimes used by nation-state actors. PKI offers mechanisms to be able to secure data in transit and at rest using multiple different modalities. For example, PKI is often considered the strongest way to authenticate a person or even a device over the internet. It is also virtually the only standards-based way to guarantee who has signed a document and sent it to a verifier to prove the authenticity of it, and guarantee that document has not changed after it was signed. That's because PKI marries both cryptography and strong identity within a certificate. And when you're digitally signing a document, you know with certainty who signed that document. And lastly, what will be the focus of this webinar is encryption or confidentiality, ensuring that only the parties you expect to be able to read a document are able to make intelligent sense of that document. In other words, somebody may be able to obtain a file, but that file is unintelligible to that person unless they're able to decrypt the document. So let's pull the thread on this a little bit more in terms of what exactly is end-to-end encryption. Ultimately, end-to-end encryption is the process of encrypting a particular email message at the sender's location before it ever leaves the sender's email client and remains encrypted throughout the transport all the way to the recipient. And at the recipient's email server, it is still encrypted. The only time when this email is decrypted is when one of these two parties wishes to read the contents of the email and they have the private key to do so, and the email client decrypts it and makes it available for them to read and process and in the decrypted form temporarily. This is quite different than transport layer security, which occurs between these two parties often. S/MIME encryption can even enjoy that layer of encryption on top, but it ultimately is not what protects the email itself. If somebody were to levy a man-in-the-middle attack between these two parties, where they were able to break the TLS encryption between these two parties, they still wouldn't be able to read the contents of the email because the email itself is what's encrypted. For this reason, it is the chosen technology for critical infrastructure sectors and governments alike due to its risk-averse nature. And it's non-proprietary. It's actually a standard, an industry standard that any organization can implement. And that's why multiple vendor products support such a standard due to its security rigor and the fact that it's open source. And lastly, one of the best aspects of PKI and S/MIME in general is the ability to be able to associate a digital identity, just like digital signatures, with strong cryptography. And this basically allows the sender of a message to know that the recipient of this message is the only entity who's going to be able to read the message if they've encrypted it using S/MIME. because they've used the public key of this individual, and the only way to decrypt it and read the contents is using the private key. So if email encryption is so powerful, so secure, why is everybody not using it? That's what we'll talk about for the rest of this presentation, is some of the challenges related to SMIME and how to overcome those challenges for your organization so you can enjoy true end-to-end encryption. Ultimately, the first challenge is actually encryption itself. It's called public key discovery. Public keys are in fact public. Anybody can obtain a public key, but knowing where to find these public keys is often not so easy. And this is the first challenge that SMIME faces. And we'll talk a bit more about that into the next slide. But first, there's another challenge related to SMIME, one that we'll spend the most amount of time in this presentation talking about, which many folks consider the management of encrypted data. In other words, how do you deal with the aftermath of end-to-end encryption? Now that you have a repository of end-to-end encrypted messages that only these two recipients are able to decrypt and see, how do you handle decryption on mobile devices? Or how do you inspect this email traffic using some kind of a content inspection gateway at the edge? How do you authorize third parties to be able to view the contents of this email for a legal proceeding? And how can you index and search these encrypted emails in a large repository for finding them for various purposes? That may be the case of any of the three other use cases we just talked about. First, we are going to tackle public key discovery on our next slide. The challenges related to public key discovery come in two flavors. The first is encryption within an organization. And this problem is largely solved. Many email servers provide the functionality for different employees to be able to discover other employees' certificates as long as they're within the same organization. That's because the central email server is able to make that available to the email clients that they're using to encrypt between all the parties. Now, this challenge is not so easy to address when you're encrypting between organizations. In other words, how can one employee in one organization discover the public certificate of an employee in a different organization? How can this problem be solved? Well, there are a couple different solutions. The first option would be LDAP chaining, where one of these directories within one organization is able to be chained or connected to another organization and effectively pull or discover certificates into one directory or in the other direction. This is a mutually agreed upon strategy between these two parties so they can encrypt between each other. The challenge is scale. Add a third party, and now the third party needs to connect to both the other two. Adding a fourth means they need to connect with all three of the other parties. And you can see how this is not going to scale. DNS is another way that you can discover public encryption certificates, although it's not very common. The direct protocol does use DNS for public key discovery, but that's one of the limited, widely used use cases for DNS, for SMIME email encryption. So a better alternative is a global encryption directory, which allows all the certificates to be stored in one location, and both parties can pull those certificates from that central repository. And this allows for scale. Any number of parties can push their certificates to this directory and make them discoverable by other organizations that wish to encrypt to any of the parties within this public directory. This is the first challenge related to SMIME email encryption, and it's specifically related to the encryption process, not the decryption process. The rest of this slide deck, we're going to talk about the challenges related to decryption as a means of being able to address a lot of the cybersecurity concerns that organizations have with email inspection, e-discovery, etc., the aftermath of email encryption. The aftermath of end-to-end encryption exists for one particular reason. Ultimately, SMIME was designed to prevent a third party from reading this email in every way possible. Ultimately, that prevents a hacker from being able to see what is inside of this email for confidentiality. Using basically any means possible, they are not going to be able to see the contents of this email, which is a very good thing. It is why SMIME is so secure. But what happens if somebody who's authorized to view the contents of this email has a business case to do so? As we talked about before, e-discovery, you have a legal proceeding and the organization needs to make available encrypted emails to a court or some other type of legal entity as part of a legal proceeding. Or imagine an employee departs an organization and the manager needs access to their encrypted emails. Or another example would be mergers and acquisitions, where the company being acquired through their discovery and due diligence process needs to make available certain emails to the acquirer. Or the acquirer, now that they've acquired that entity, needs to merge those emails into their email archive. These all present problems related to S/MIME email encryption and end-to-end encryption itself. And somehow organizations need to be able to overcome the challenge of decryption in an enterprise setting by a third party, which again is exactly what S/MIME was designed to prevent. To make matters worse, people don't encrypt emails that are not important. So if an investigator or some entity wants to view the contents, and they're authorized to do so, of an email or a set of emails, ultimately the encrypted ones are probably the ones they need access to because they contain the sensitive email they're looking for. So to address the challenges of data e-discovery first, we need to introduce a new concept. It's called a key escrow. This is a repository of all the private keys of the first organization and the second organization. And those private keys are stored separately by the respective entities. Oftentimes, these key escrows are actually stored by the entity who issued the certificates, which may not be the organization itself, but rather a third party, in which case this key escrow is not actually stored within the enterprise boundary of the organization using those certificates and those private keys for S/MIME email encryption. So one way to be able to leverage a key escrow to decrypt this data, which the primary purpose of is to make keys available for decryption, is to actually send data to the key escrow. For example, you have a sensitive email and you want to send that information to a key escrow to be able to decrypt it and then provide the decrypted version back. However, if the key escrow is not located within the organizational boundary and you went through great lengths to make sure you're using end-to-end encryption, what is the point of sending an end-to-end encryption email outside of the organizational boundary and then returning the decrypted version back? It really defeats the whole reason why you were using end-to-end encryption in the first place. Secondly, best practices in private key management suggest that you should limit the exfiltration of these private keys to the maximum extent possible. They are safest when they are inside the key escrow protected by the HSM. As soon as they come out, that private key is vulnerable. And often it's used for this exact purpose, to recover a private key to decrypt data. In either case, either of these two strategies can be used to decrypt an email, but it ultimately may not be the best option for decrypting these emails in an enterprise setting. So an alternative approach is to use a decryption server. And ultimately, this decryption server also has an HSM, and it temporarily pulls a private key into the decryption server. And this private key exists there long enough to be able to decrypt the data. But the special piece here is that the data does not actually need to be sent to the decryption server. In other words, the email contents itself does not need to be sent to this entity. And private keys are not sent to the investigator. Instead, the decryption server uses a construct built into the S/MIME standard called a session key. And instead, session keys are sent where the data is located to the decryption server for decryption and then returned. And that session key is used to decrypt the contents of the email itself. This is the best way to decrypt data. And we're going to keep coming back to this content and this specific use case for data decryption throughout the rest of this presentation. It is a method that organizations can use to always protect their private keys at all times without sending their data outside of the organizational boundary and returning it in decrypted form. So one of the other use cases for a decryption server, or ultimately decryption in general, is indexing, searching, and archiving. Algorithms that do these functions, indexing and searching specifically, need the ability to read the contents of an email to carry out indexing and searching. And often this occurs within an email archiving system. So the question becomes, how can this email archiving system process and read the contents of the encrypted message? So again, we'll explore some strategies to overcome this problem. The first is worth mentioning that you need a decryption agent. In any case, If email is going to flow from the organizational employees to an email archive, you need to decrypt it at some point. And this decryption agent can exist in line, where emails are sent to the decryption agent, decrypted, and then sent to the email archive. Or this decryption agent can actually exist as a plugin within the email archive. But in either case, you need a decryption agent. And ultimately, this decryption agent can function in a number of different ways. The first way is what we talked about before, where either the decryption agent sends emails to the key escrow for decryption, and these will be a lot of emails. Basically, any email that's encrypted is sent over the key to the key escrow for decryption. Or the key escrow provides private keys to the decryption agent. In either case, we talked about the challenges with this and why it may not be following best practices. So an alternative is to again use a decryption server, where the private key is escrowed into this decryption server and session keys are exchanged between the decryption server and the decryption agent. But the data itself never leaves the decryption agent, and the private keys never leave the protection of an HSM. The next use case we'll talk about is email inspection gateways. They are a service that sits on the edge of an organizational boundary, and all email traffic flows through this inspection gateway. It's looking for various types of information as information both flows in and out of the gateway. And if emails are flowing into this gateway that are encrypted, how can this email inspection gateway actually carry out its inspection? There are a couple of challenges related to this that we'll talk about here next. The first is called data loss prevention. This is the process where an employee within one organization encrypts information and then sends it out of the organizational boundary to some recipient. In this context, an email inspection gateway is not going to prevent the loss of that information because it cannot read the email. And that ends up being problematic for the organization because it has now lost this information, and they were employing an actual service to be able to prevent that from happening. But if it can't read it, then it will not be able to fulfill its duties. And in the other direction, you have malware, phishing, and other attacks, which is often the most common use case from email inspection gateway for catching junk email and phishing attacks and other types of emails that may not be best for the recipients of the organization to receive, and they can be stopped right at the email inspection gateway. However, again, if the inspection gateway cannot actually inspect the contents of the email, oftentimes they just flow straight through to the recipient. That's because often these gateways use TLS inspection, where the two parties can actually exchange emails in transit securely using transport layer security. And this email inspection gateway is actually able to break that TLS session, basically causing a man-in-the-middle attack on purpose. And it allows this inspection gateway to be able to read the contents of all email traffic, except for end-to-end encrypted email traffic. And that is ultimately the problem that we're aiming to solve. So next slide, we'll talk about some strategies that organizations can implement to be able to overcome this challenge. The first, again, looks very similar to the previous slides we've talked about, which ultimately is the process of a key escrow, where the email is sent to the key escrow for decryption, or the private key is provided to the email inspection gateway. If this strategy is used, it's particularly egregious violation of a lot of industry best practices related to private key management, because this email inspection gateway exists on the edge. So not only are the private keys being exfiltrated from the key escrow, but they're being sent to the edge of the network, making them most vulnerable for exfiltration outside the organizational boundary by folks who are not supposed to have that private key. So this is discouraged significantly through industry best practices to actually provide this inspection gateway with private keys. The alternative is just what we've been discussing, a decryption server, where instead this email inspection gateway is capable of connecting with a decryption server and just exchanges session keys instead of sensitive data or private keys itself. The last use case we'll talk about is mobility. Ultimately, since an email is encrypted by one party, sent to the other, this entity is only able to decrypt this email if they have the private key. So what happens if they want to view this email on a mobile device? How will they be able to decrypt the contents of this email if the private key is not on this device? Ultimately, this scenario does not actually lend itself as much to a data decryption server. It can be used here, but industry best practices suggest that the private key used by this entity ought to be recovered to the phone. And this primarily is used for software-based private keys. Hardware-based private keys are more challenging. There are solutions to that too, but that's outside of the scope of this presentation. And ultimately, when the private key is recovered to the phone, the user is able to decrypt that message natively using the email clients on these devices, which of course support SMIME, given that it's an industry standard. I hope these challenges and solutions have been useful as you plan through your enterprise deployment of end-to-end encryption. Ziva provides many products that support this endeavor. Decrypt in a Box is in fact a decryption server, and ZivaCrypt is a global encryption directory. We also have other PKI-based products that can help you use your certificates more usefully within your organization and increase the return on your investment. Thank you very much.